Well, hello there and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Casey and I'm the designer behind the indie sewing pattern company, Pattern Scout. Today I'm going to be sharing with you a sew along for my newest pattern, the Ava dress. At the beginning of this year, I gave myself a goal to create 3 new patterns and launch 3 new patterns before the summer, which I did. I'm so excited, it feels good, and now I can create more content for you guys. Today I'm going to be sewing version A of this dress. Version A is just an above the knee length dress. It also comes as a maxi length, so down to the ankles. I've also seen people sew it as a midi length, so like right at the calves, which I think looks fantastic. So that's an option too. I love the style of this dress. It's very modern and simple. It's a faux wrap bodice that's gathered at the waist. It's sleeveless, but the shoulder is extended just slightly past the shoulder point, so it gives it kind of a more modern silhouette. And the skirt is a column skirt, so it's not super flowy and billowy. It's a little bit more straight, which I also love. And on the version B skirt, there are slits in the side seams to allow more free movement there. So it's actually very comfortable to wear. I think it can be worn very casual or dressed up. I think that the maxi length version would make a beautiful bridesmaid's dress. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe you're planning a wedding. If you want to see how other people have made this dress in the sewing community, you can check out the hashtag #PSAvaDress on Instagram. Several have been posted so far. I'll also share a link in the description below to the tester roundup. So I'll show the versions that the testers made. They turned out really beautiful. I'm so proud and so impressed with how the dresses turned out. And you can also see them on different types of bodies and see the ways that different people approach this pattern. This dress is available in US sizes 0 to 30. And on my size chart, that goes up to a 60-inch hip and a 58-inch bust. And I think 48-inch waist. I'll double check that. As far as fabric types that you want to use for this dress, it is recommended to use woven fabrics, so fabrics with no stretch. For today's tutorial, I'm going to be using a red linen that I picked up at Joann stores. Linen is perfect for this dress. It's very easy to work with. It's not going to be too shifty when you're trying to sew with it, and it's really easy to wear, and it gets more beautiful with wear too. I think that the linen that's been worn a lot has a really gorgeous hand and texture to it, so I definitely recommend linen. Other fabrics that are great for this are rayon. Rayon is beautiful, and like tencel twill is really nice for this. The thing about rayon and tencel is that it will be a little bit more shifty. So if you're not as experienced sewing, maybe save that for a later version after you practice a little bit, because it will get a little frustrating. But the pink version that I made that out of a tencel twill, and it is really beautiful to wear. It flows really nicely. Although I definitely said a few curse words while I was making that one because it was really a pain in the butt. Pretty much any kind of medium to lightweight woven fabric is going to work beautifully for this. So yeah, you have a lot of options there. You can also save 15% on the Ava dress pattern on my website at patternscoutstudio.com if you use the code YOUTUBEAVA. And I'll put a link in the description below to the pattern and just enter that code at checkout and it'll take 15% off the pattern for you guys. Okay, I think that's it. Let's get started on the sew along. Pattern pieces for this project include a back bodice, 2 front bodice pieces cut mirrored, and I've also marked the location of the darts on the front bodice on the wrong side of fabric. I've got a back skirt, a front skirt, and I've cut facings and matching interfacings for the front armhole, the back armhole, the back neckline, and the front wrap edges. And last, I have a casing for the waist elastic. The first step is to attach the interfacing to the facings. And instead of adhering the interfacing to the facings, I'm first sewing these together along the raw edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance with right sides together. So I've got the adhesive side on the outside and the smooth side against the right side of the fabric. I'm doing this for all of the facings, so for the armhole facings, I'll be sewing along that outer curved edge. Once that's sewn together, you can see I've sewn it on the short edge of the wrap edge facings. And I'm just going to kind of finger press this to get it started, and then I'm going to flip this to the wrong side and then adhere it with my iron. And this just creates a nicer edge along that raw edge instead of having to serge it or turn it under, and everything is nicely concealed. So here I'm just very quickly tapping that with my iron just to get it adhered a little bit so that I can flip it over and fully adhere it from the right side of fabric. And now you can see that's very nicely finished on that raw edge. For the curved facings, I'm going to clip into the seam allowance just to kind of open up that curve a little bit and make it easier to turn so that it's not too wrinkled when I turn the curve toward the inside. So you can see I've cut little notches out And I want to make sure that I get all of those little pieces of interfacing off my ironing board because they will stick. Then again, I'm going to just kind of turn this with my hands, tap it with the iron, then turn it over and press the facing to adhere it to the interfacing. Next up is attaching the facings to the bodice. So I want to make sure that I attach these right sides together, and the facings have notches. So the front facings have a single notch and the back facings have a double notch so that you can make sure that you're matching it up with the right armhole. The facings are also just very slightly short of the side seam. This is going to aid in pulling that facing taut once we sew the whole thing together. I'm going to sew these facings to the bodice with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm also going to do the back bodice and again sew these with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. For the wrap edge, you may find that you have to kind of ease in the facing if it stretches out a little bit just because that's cut on the bias. Once those are sewn, I'm going to trim the seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm using my rotary cutter here, but if you do this, just be really careful so you can see how that looks once it's trimmed. Then I'm going to press the facings away from the bodice, making sure that the seam allowance is pressed toward the facing. Then I'm going to understitch that seam allowance to the facings from the right side of fabric. And I'm doing this very close to the edge of that seam, probably about a 1/16 of an inch. And you can see that's caught that seam allowance underneath. For the armholes, I'm just kind of going slow and spreading that apart as I go under the needle. Then I'll press the facings toward the wrong side of the bodice. And it should fold nice and neatly. And since we've understitched that, it'll kind of help keep that facing turned toward the wrong side of the bodice. And I'm pressing it again from the right side of fabric. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew my darts for the front bodice. I'm just matching up the dart notches at the side seam, and I'm just going to press that in place. You can also pin this. I usually don't. I like to just press it in place, and then I have lines drawn, which you can't really see here, but I'm going to sew that dart along the line there. And instead of back stitching, I'm going to actually tie the thread tails into a knot and then trim those to finish the dart. Then I'll just take this over to the ironing board and press the dart down. Now, if you have a fuller chest, I've heard that it actually helps reduce bulk if you press the dart in the upward position, so that's something to consider if you find that darts get a little bulky. I've also attached the facings to the back bodice, and now I can attach the front bodice pieces to the back bodice. I'm going to be using French seams here. So first I'm going to attach these wrong sides together, and I've pulled all of those facings out and I'm attaching those facings wrong sides together as well, and I'm going to sew along the shoulders and the side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once I get that sewn together, I'm going to trim my seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. And again, I'm using my rotary cutter. Just be careful when you do this. So I'll do that for all of the seams here. Then I'll take this over to the ironing board and I'm going to press those little tiny seams open first. And then I will fold that with right sides together, and I'm going to press that seam again. I'm going to press it flat. And I'll do that for all of these seams. Then I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance this time to conceal that raw edge and finish the French seams. Once I have those sewn, I'm actually going to go in with my scissors and I'm going to clip into the seam allowance right at the edge where the facing attaches to the bodice. This is going to help me flip those seams in opposite directions when I fold the facings down. So I'll press the seams toward the back bodice, and then the facing seams will be pressed toward the front bodice so that when I fold that facing down, I can kind of nest those seams next to each other, and it helps just to reduce the bulk. So I'm going to make sure I pin right there at that seam. I'm going to do this for all of the seams. So here I've got everything pinned in place for all of the facings, and I'm going to top stitch those facings in place everywhere. And for this one, I'm using the 1 inch mark on my sewing machine as a guide. You can also sew right along that edge of the facing if you want to use that as a guide. So right here, my seam is probably about 1/4 inch from the edge of that facing on the interior, but from the exterior, it's a 1 inch seam. And I'm doing the same thing for the armhole facings here. I'm just going all the way around and taking care when I go over those seams where the French seams are, because it can get a little bulky. And that's how it looks from the inside and from the exterior. Now that the bodice is mostly done, I can attach the bottom edge of the wrap. So at the waistline of the bodice, there are notches, and this is where that wrap point is going to meet up on each side. So I'm going to pin that in place, making sure that that point lines up exactly with that notch. And then I'm just going to sew along that bottom edge where the wrap overlaps to keep that in place. Okay, so I've just tried on the bodice just to see how everything fits, make sure everything is falling the way it should. This is the 12C cup. So this pattern comes with 3 cup sizes. It's got a B cup, a C cup, and a D cup. And as you can see, it lays pretty easily over the top. I am going to top stitch down the wrap just because this is a looser fit in the bodice, and it will be gathered here at the bottom. Top stitching that down is going to keep this from flying open. It is just a faux wrap style. But anyway, it should kind of fall pretty naturally over the bust without any massive gapping. If you do have gapping, you may need to go up in a cup size, or if you are, if your bust is larger than the D cup size for your size, you may need to do an FBA on top of that D cup. So if you are a little bit larger in the chest, you may just require a little bit more fine tuning there. But right now, the C cup, I like where the darts are falling. Happy with the fit in the arm side. If you do find that there is a little bit of tightness here, you can always, on the pattern piece before you cut your pieces, you can make this part of the curve a little bit deeper here, or you can drop it here under the arm side. But anyway, I'm pretty happy with the fit of this. I'm gonna keep moving forward. I'm gonna top stitch this down and add the skirt and finish the dress. I've got this laid flat on my table again, and I'm taking my time to align these wrap edges really nice and flat. So I'll put a pin in and kind of pick up the fabric to make sure that nothing is shifting. And then I'm just going to top stitch along that triangle where the wrap overlaps. And again, I'm going really slow here, even though I've got the video sped up quite a bit, but I'm just sewing right along that edge of that wrap. I pivot at the top and come down the opposite side, and I'm using my thumb to kind of feel for the edge of that wrap on the underside. Okay, and here is how that looks with the bodice stitched together at the wrap. And so you can kind of see here, I've got my top stitching following the edge of the wrap here, and I've also followed the edge of it from the inside as well, just to create a nice little top stitching detail there. And now I'm ready to attach the skirt. I'll be sewing the skirt also with French seams. So I've got the back skirt here with wrong side facing up, and I'm laying the top skirt or front skirt on top with wrong side facing down. I'm going to sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance first, then I'll trim that down to an 1/8 inch, press that seam open the same way I did for the bodice, and then I will flip that to the other side with wrong sides facing out, right sides together, and I will press that seam flat in a folded position. And then I will sew again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to finish the French seam and conceal that raw edge, which you can see here. Once I have the French seams completed, I'm going to press that seam allowance toward the front of the skirt instead of the back, because this will nest nicely with the bodice once we attach the bodice to the skirt. Now I've got my elastic casing, and I am pressing a 3/8 inch fold toward the wrong side along the bottom edge of the casing. So the notches are along the top edge, I'm pressing this along the bottom edge. I'm also going to press a 3/8 inch fold in either end of this casing, again toward the wrong side of the fabric. Now I can attach the casing to the skirt. The skirt is wrong side out, and I've got the casing facing wrong side up. So I'm first aligning the center back. There are double notches at the center back of the casing to the skirt. Then I'll align the side seams, and then I'll flip this over and align the edge of that fold with the 2 notches on the front of the skirt, which meets up with the wrap overlap of the front bodice. And I'll sew the casing to the skirt with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once I have the casing attached, I can insert the bodice into the skirt with right sides together. Then I'm going to align the center back, again marked with 2 notches, and pin that in place. I'll align the side seams, making sure that those seams of the skirt and the bodice are going in opposite directions to reduce bulk. And then I'll align that wrap overlap with the skirt at the front where the casing meets those notches. And I'm just pinning this in place to make sure that everything is nice and flat. And I'll sew around the entire perimeter with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. If I pull the bodice out, you can see how that's attached there. The casing will eventually be flipped up like this, but first I want to finish that raw seam allowance where the wrap overlap is. So I'm just going to clip into the seam allowance a little bit past that casing so that that will be concealed later. I'll do that on both sides of that wrap overlap, and I'm just clipping into the bodice, so I'm not clipping the casing. Then I'm going to trim the seam allowance of the rest of the skirt, leaving that seam allowance untrimmed for now at the wrap overlap part. And I'm trimming that down to about 1/8 of an inch. Now I need to finish that raw edge, so I'm flipping down the skirt seam allowance out of the way, and I'm going to trim the bodice seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. Then I'll take this over to the ironing board, and I'm going to create a flat felled seam here. So I'm turning that longer seam allowance over the one that I just trimmed to kind of conceal that edge there, and I'm going to press that in place. Then once that is pressed, I'll flip the whole thing up toward the bodice and press it in place again. And this is going to conceal the raw edges of that seam allowance where the wrap overlap is. Then I'll press the casing up toward the bodice around the entire bodice. Once I have everything pressed in place, I'm just going to top stitch that flat felled seam down to finish it. And then I will top stitch the casing edge down around the entire bodice. And I'm top stitching that down really close to the edge there for that flat felled seam. So you can see that's nicely finished now on the interior, and that's how it looks on the exterior. Now I'm just going to go around and top stitch the casing down along the top edge around the entire perimeter of the bodice. And I'm just edge stitching this about 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of the bodice. I'll do that all the way around to the opposite side. And I'm just going to leave the end of that casing unstitched because this is where we're going to insert the elastic. And here's how that looks from the exterior. And you can see where the wrap top stitching is and the flat felled seam. I've also added an additional row of top stitching to that wrap overlap just so that it looks the same on both sides of that triangle. I'm going to turn this inside out, and now I can insert the elastic into the casing. So I've grabbed 2 safety pins here, and I'm going to attach one pin to the end of my elastic and use that to help me feed the elastic through the casing. Now I'm using a 1-inch elastic here. The recommendation is 3/4 inch, so mine was kind of a pain to get it in there. So I definitely recommend 3/4 inch for this project. And I just fed that all the way around to the other end. Once I got that in, I kind of tucked the elastic into the edge there. I pinned it in place with the safety pins, and now I'm just going to top stitch the ends of the elastic into the casing with 2 rows of top stitching on each side. Then I can remove the safety pin and the elastic is secure. The last step is to hem the dress. So I'm turning this first by about 3/8 of an inch, and then again by 1 inch toward the interior of the garment, and then I will top stitch that in place. And that is it, folks. It is time for the reveal. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found this sew along helpful and that you're ready to sew your own Ava dress. If you do sew an Ava dress and you want to share it with us online, you can use the hashtag #PSAvaDress on Instagram, and be sure to tag me, Pattern Scout, and that way I'll see it, and then you can share it with other people in the sewing community, and you can see what other people have made. There's been a lot of beautiful Ava dresses popping up since I launched the pattern. Okay, I think that is all I have for you today. I hope you're having a beautiful start to your summer, and I will see you in the next video. Bye! At the beginning of this year, I gave myself a goal to release 3 new patterns It's sleeveless, but it's summer, summertime. What else?